Today's lecture is on East Asia. On this map you see the countries that make up East Asia, and for the purposes of our lecture we're going to be focusing primarily on China. And the reason for that is because China is the oldest civilization in this area, and it had a very heavy influence on all of the other countries that you see here. So most of our time during this lecture we'll spend in China. We're going to spend some time talking about Korea, and we'll wrap it up by talking about Japan. So we'll start right in with China. As you see on the slide here, Chinese civilization is over 4,000 years old. And the word China itself means Middle Kingdom, or the center of the world, which is the way that the people saw themselves. At present, there are about 1.3 billion people in China, and it would be a mistake to think of the Chinese as a homogeneous people, because there are several different ethnic groups in China, and the language that's spoken by these 1.3 billion people encompasses several different dialects. And it's interesting that some of these dialects are so different in the differing parts of China that some Chinese cannot understand. People from other regions can't understand their dialects. So it's just a reflection of how large this country is and how many different types of people and different cultures and different even languages that exist there. We're going to talk a lot about the geography and the growing conditions in China. And as you've seen over the course of this class, the what is grown and what is eaten in different countries really has a lot to do with climate. And so we're going to see in China that what's grown in the northern part versus the southern part is very different. As I mentioned, Chinese civilization played a major role in the development of both Japanese and Korean cultures. So there are a lot of similarities there, and we'll see that with the food, we'll see it with the religion, we'll see it with family structure, and even with the health practices and traditional health beliefs. But there are some important differences as well that we will get into. We're going to start, however, not in China, but we're going to talk about the immigration patterns of early Chinese to the United States and why they came. And the picture that you see in this slide is a picture of Chinese immigrants that is taken not too far from our area. This is up in the Auburn area. And of course, in the 1840s, 1850s, there was a tremendous gold rush here in California and drew a lot of people from all over to make their fortune. And quite a few of the people that came to take advantage of this were Chinese. So the very first immigration that we saw were of these Chinese men, and it was pretty much exclusively men that came over. And what their plan was to come to California, strike it rich, and then go back to China. They didn't have, many of them had no intention of staying. In fact, it was very common for these single men to marry before coming to the United States, to California specifically, leaving their brides in China and then going back. And ultimately, about half of the Chinese that came to the United States ended up going back to China, and very few with any major fortune to speak of. Actually, the ones that ended up being very successful were the ones that not that they found gold, but they ended up opening other businesses that helped support the miners in the area. So laundries and restaurants were really common. By the 1870s, 63,000 Chinese were in the United States, and nearly all were on the West Coast, again for the gold rush. During the 1870s, another 120,000 Chinese are estimated to have immigrated. So that first rush was here because of the gold, but the subsequent Chinese that came, and again, these are mostly men that were coming, were there for economic opportunities and job opportunities. And many of them joined the railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad. The railroad that connects the country goes. These rail lines that go back and forth across the entire country were built in large part by Chinese immigrants coming to the United States seeking out that opportunity. About 94% of the Chinese that came were from the Canton region, and we'll talk about that as we get further into the lecture. And the thing about Canton is Cantonese cooking is a particular type of cooking. As we talked about, China is a very large country, so the ingredients are different, as we said, but also the cooking styles are very different. And so the first Chinese cooking that Americans were exposed to was Cantonese cooking. So although there are ranges, tons of styles of cooking all throughout this very large country of China, in the United States what we tend to think of as Chinese cooking is Cantonese cooking because of that very early exposure that in the United States that we had to Chinese. And so there are a lot of other styles of Chinese cooking that really may not be quite as familiar to Americans as Cantonese cooking. From the 1880s on, there was a dramatic slowdown in the immigration of Chinese to the United States, and that is because there are a variety of acts, and we're going to talk about these laws as we go through the lecture because they also applied to Koreans, Chinese, and other Asians, starting really around the turn of the century, that prohibited the immigration of Asians into the United States. So in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act happened, and that prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers. So without more Chinese coming into the United States, the Chinese population dropped because, again, several immigrants went back to China and no new ones were coming in. Many Chinese congregated in urban Chinatown neighborhoods in large cities. And because of these exclusion laws, there was a lot of, or really because of the prejudice involved, the prejudice involved was perhaps the evolution of these exclusion laws. Many Chinese and other Asians were subject to hostility from white Americans. And so huddling in smaller insular communities, these Chinatowns really afforded them protection, not only from the hostility, but also a place to continue to practice their cultural beliefs and values. So San Francisco, of course, is a very large Chinatown, and the picture that you see there on the slide is the gateway entrance to Chinatown in San Francisco, which is on Grant Avenue at Bush Street. So if you've never been there, it's a really neat thing to go take a look at. There are other really large Chinatowns in Oakland, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. Usually any large metropolitan area, urban area, generally has a Chinatown, and the older the urban area, the more likely there is to be a Chinatown there. It wasn't until 1943 that Chinese people could become naturalized American citizens, because that's when around World War II these exclusion acts really started to ease off and not be as much as prevalent as they had been around the turn of the 20th century. The Chinese exclusion laws were repealed in 1943. And since that time, we've seen an increase of Chinese coming into the United States, and many of them sticking around and obtaining citizenship. We've seen a very large influx since 1990, and the reason for that is that there has been, around that time, there was a lot of political instability. China is a communist government, and there was in 1989 in particular, a lot of political instability that caused people to want to come to the United States. The student protests, pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989 spurred many young Chinese to come to the United States. And as a direct result of that uprising, the U.S. immigration laws were changed. This Chinese Student Protection Act of 1992 granted visas and eligibility for the United States citizenship, and so many took advantage of that. And there was also the shift of the city of Hong Kong, great economic power, had for many, many years been under the control of the United Kingdom. And that Hong Kong was turned back over to the Chinese around that time as well. And there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not Hong Kong would continue to be granted the amount of freedom that it had enjoyed under British rule. And so that spurred many Chinese living in Hong Kong to come to the United States as well. In the 2007, the U.S. indicated that 3.3 million Chinese and Taiwanese people are living in the United States. And folks from this area of the world represent nearly a quarter of all Asians living in the United States. Most of the Chinese that live in the United States reside in California. There are quite a few in New York, and then other large populations in Hawaii and some of the other larger urban areas in Chicago, New Jersey, and Atlanta. We'll shift and talk about worldview for China, and we'll start with religion. Because China has a communist government, officially it is atheist. So that is a tenet of communist, the communist belief and philosophy. And so officially it's atheist. However, their Chinese history is very, very old, and there's a lot of religious history as well. Chinese religious history is made up of the beliefs of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And we've touched on these a little bit throughout the course, and particularly when we talked about the food and religion lecture, but we'll just go over them briefly here. Confucianism is not so much a religion as it is a philosophy or a way of thinking. Confucius was a figure who really sort of came up with these rules that were considered to be the proper way to live. So Confucianism defines the ways people should live and work together to produce harmony. And we find over and over again in many Asian religions and Asian philosophies that harmony is extremely valued and something that should be pursued at all costs. Confucianism prizes self-restraint to retain honor for self and family. So this is another culture where the way that you act can reflect well or poorly not only on you but on your entire family. Social reciprocity is important. A little trouble with that word. Treating others as you want to be treated is also important. So essentially the golden rule. And that's Confucianism, very basic ideas. Taoism is very similar to Confucianism, but also believes that people are subordinate to what's called nature's way. So nature should always be very balanced, balanced harmony. So there's that same idea again. So it's very concerned with the yin and yang concept. And if you remember, when we talk about yin and yang, we're talking about different forces that balance each other out, hot and cold, male and female, those sorts of things. And then Buddhism, we covered in the Food and Religion lecture, so you can take a look at that and refamiliarize yourself with it. Most Chinese Americans are not affiliated with a specific church. Generally, spirituality is integrated into family and community life. Many Chinese mix the tenets of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and they also will throw in ancestor worship sometimes, which is a way of either appeasing or asking your ancestors that have passed on for help and assistance, and doing things to appease them so that they don't become angry with you and cause problems. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. Daily living might include avoiding any actions that might offend the gods, whatever gods we're talking about, nature, ancestors. And ceremonies for the dead are generally very important because many believe that the ancestors can influence the lives of the living, and it's up to the living to help produce a comfortable afterlife for those who have already passed on. So they see that it's sort of reciprocal for those that practice ancestor worship. There are some inroads that have been made with Christianity in the Chinese community. Both Catholic and Protestant churches were present in U.S. Chinatown neighborhoods very early on. Generally, Christianity is more popular with American-born descendants of Chinese immigrants than the Chinese immigrants themselves. So, you see a lot more Chinese Christian churches in the United States now as a result of that. The family life is generally very influenced by Confucianism. Across the board, not only with China, but many Asian cultures, they are very patriarchal. Marriages are often arranged, and women in Chinese culture are what is known as thrice obeying. They obey the men in their lives, fathers initially. Girls are submissive to their father and their eldest brother initially. Wives are subordinate to husbands, and mothers obey their sons when widowed. So very, very patriarchal society. Harmony is the family ideal. So there's the idea of harmony again. And harmony is pursued regardless of the situation. So children are taught this very early. You do not fight, you do not cry. Showing any kind of emotion is very discouraged in traditional Chinese family structure. So it's all in the pursuit of harmony. The family is seen as a singular unit, and individual needs or ambitions can be seen as disruptive. So this is another culture where the group is much more important than the individual. So the group moves together, and individuality is not really something that is really celebrated or really even thought about so much, because it's a unit. As with many cultures of this type that we've talked about in this class, this type of setup, this group setup and group unit, works very well in the native country, but tends not to work so well in the United States. We also see that with the heavily patriarchal societies or societies where women are very submissive to men, because coming to the United States, things were a little bit different, and to meet economic needs and to fit in, it really can be very disruptive to this traditional structure. So many times we can find that there is a disagreement between the initial immigrants and their subsequent generations, children and grandchildren, may not be on the same page as their parents or their grandparents, and of course that could cause a lot of strife and tension. In the traditional health practices lecture, we talked a bit about traditional Chinese medicine, and so this is probably a little bit of a refresher here. Beliefs and practices have been developed over millennia. Traditional Chinese medicine and medical practice is thought to be about 2,500 years old. And they incorporate Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist concepts to get to the idea of harmony and balance, as we've talked about over and over again. There are a lot of folk remedies out there. Traditional Chinese medicine itself employs a humoral system, and if you remember from that health practices lecture, when we talked about the humors, we talked about the different liquids of the human body. So here we're talking about perspiration, saliva, mucus, those sorts of things. And the humoral system is combined with 5 earth elements. And there's also a matching to seasons and other various things, with the idea, the ultimate idea, that everything needs to be in balance. And so the elements, as you see here in the slide, are fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And all of these elements correspond to the different things that you see there, the liquids, the organs of the body, seasons, colors, those sorts of things. So fire is associated with heart, perspiration, summer, red, bitter, in the direction of south. And these elements, when they show up, of course, the whole idea of this equilibrium and this balance and harmony is that if you have too much fire, for example, you need something to balance it out, like water, to balance that out. And the overall thought is that complete balance is where health is, and anytime you're out of balance is where disease happens. So everything must be in balance for Qi. You see Qi, which is the term for the vital force of life, as it's seen in Chinese traditional medicine. Qi must flow freely, and everything, it must be in balance in order for that to happen, and any disequilibrium equals disease. We'll switch to traditional food habits in China, and I think that many times when Westerners think of Asia and Asian countries, the food that comes to mind first is rice, and that's certainly true with China. However, it's more true in southern China than it is in northern China. And that's just simply because rice grows better in southern China. Rice is thought to have been introduced to China in the 1st century BC from India, and it grew very well there, so very quickly became a staple food, and replaced what had been the primary grain, which was millet. We talked a little bit about millet when we talked about Africa, but it was a real common grain that was steamed and served really sort of in the same way that rice did. Rice was served, and rice really sort of replaced it in China, southern China. Northern China, wheat is much more common. So the foods that you see that are northern Chinese are more associated with wheat. So these are things like noodles. In the picture there you see bao, which is wheat dough that is stuffed with some sort of a filling, whether it's meat or vegetables or some sort of mixture of those. Those are steamed and served up. Those are more common in the north because of the wheat. Buckwheat is also something really common. If you recall, when we talked about Russia, former Soviet Union, buckwheat was a real common grain there as well. And Russia and China share a border, northern China, and so again, growing conditions are really good for wheat and buckwheat in that area. But the Chinese use the wheat very differently than the Russians do. Complementary foods include mushrooms are ubiquitous. They are everywhere. They're in everything. Very, very common flavor. Um, Sauces such as soy sauce and all sorts of other soy products, and sauces made with soy. Bean sauces, fermented bean sauces are particularly common. Onions, garlic, ginger, other spices that are common to that area and to India we find very frequently in Chinese cooking. Secondary foods, it's important to note that Chinese don't tend to eat meat on a daily basis, but when they do eat meat, pork is very common, extremely common. Mutton, chicken, fish, duck, eggs, and then soy products are very common. Of course, soy is a good source of protein and it's a lot cheaper than animal protein, so something that is used very frequently in China. Chinese cookery is generally very heavily dominated by vegetables, and you see a lot of different varieties of Chinese vegetables used throughout different dishes. Fruits, on the other hand, are not nearly as common, and it's unusual that fresh fruit would be eaten on its own or with meals. There are a lot of foods that are common in China, but as we've seen in a lot of other areas of the world, they're not indigenous. The most notable ingredient here are really the chili peppers. And we see that not only in China, but we see that throughout Asia. And different areas of Asia, different countries use chili peppers differently. But as we know, those originated in the New World and were brought into Asia and really took off as an ingredient. Meat is expensive, not only in China, but anywhere. And like many places in the world, because meat is so expensive, it's not a regular part of the diet. So many don't eat meat on a daily basis. They'll eat another protein substitute, such as tofu or other soy products. But of meat, pork is the most commonly consumed. So you'll see a lot of pork used in Chinese cooking. And in fact, it's so popular in China that the Chinese government actually actively works to stabilize pork prices so that pork farmers are able to grow pork and have a good livelihood, and there's a constant supply to meet the demands of the Chinese public. Dairy products are not real common, not only in China but throughout Asia. We don't see a lot of dairy products used. There are a few notable exceptions, but in general, the Asian cuisines generally don't use any dairy products, so it's not something you're going to see real typically. Tea is the most common beverage. Green teas, black teas, oolong teas, real common, again, not only in China, but throughout Asia. Something else that's notable about Chinese food is that eating raw food is not that common. Most of the food that is eaten is cooked. So it's not real common in China to see things like fresh salads, and we talked about fresh fruits and those things, those sorts of things. Generally, food is going to be cooked. Generally with some sort of a staple starch, whether it's wheat or rice-based or millet. The Chinese are similar to the Japanese in that the content of the food is less important than how you prepare the food and how the food is presented. And the picture that you see in this slide is a picture of Asian vegetable and fruit carving, and you can see that the in this picture you have watermelons that have been carved very elaborately, and some other fruits down there. This is high art in China and Japan, and you see it very commonly where there's a lot of attention to detail put into how food is presented on the plate, and that's very, very important. The plating is many times going to reflect what kind of food is being served. So if you're serving something that is meant to be sort of a cooling kind of dish, or something that's light and cool, the plating and the garnish are going to reflect that. So maybe colors of blues and greens and pale colors are going to be used to reflect that dish, whereas something that is fiery and hot, or something that's served in the fall, might have more powerful reds and yellows associated with it in the garnish and in the plating. So how the food looks is extremely important, and it's important everywhere, but in many Asian cultures they take this to another level. The presentation is extremely important. China itself is divided into several culinary regions, depending on who you ask. Some experts may say that there are 8 different regions. We're going to focus on 5 of them, and this is a rough map. You can kind of see where these different regions are. Culinary regions we're going to concern ourselves with are Shandong and Honan in northern China, the Sichuan and Hunan in southern China, Yunnan in southern China, and the Cantonese also in southern China. And if you remember, when we were talking about the gold rush and the first U.S. immigrants that came over from China for the gold rush, they came from the Canton area. And that's the area, it's down around Hong Kong, as you can see in the south. And they brought their cooking and their ingredients and their cooking techniques with them. And so the Cantonese cooking is, again, the one that tends to be most common to Westerners, to Americans. When we think of Chinese cooking, the cooking of that region is what we tend to think of. Northern China cuisine, typical dishes are things, as you see on the slide here, Peking duck, mushu pork, sweet and sour fish, less of the rice for reasons of the farming situation. It doesn't grow quite as well, as we've been saying, and more wheat. So breads are actually eaten, dumplings, noodles, those sorts of things that are made with wheat. Cooking styles, we see a lot of grilling, a lot of barbecue. In the area of Mongolia, which is northern China, sort of sandwiched between northern China and Russia, we see a Mongolian barbecue or Mongolian hot pot. And that's actually what you see on the slide there, where there's a variety of different types of food that are cooked in like a hot stock to prepare them, and then they're eaten, and then the stock that's left over after everything that's been cooked in it is generally consumed as a beverage. In northern China, the flavor profiles we tend to see are there's a lot of sweet and sour that has to do with food preservation. And we see a lot of salty, and of course we see a lot of salty throughout Asian cuisine. It's not limited just to China, but because a lot of the ingredients that are used just tend to have a lot of salt in them, a soy sauce, and even today Chinese cuisine and many Asian cuisines are just very high in sodium, and that is because of the traditional preservation techniques. Salt is a real common way to preserve foods, and as we've found throughout this class, the traditional ways of food preservation, flavors associated with that tend to linger in the traditional cuisine, whether it's salty or sour or something along those lines. Southern China, we see rice, a lot more rice. We see hot and sour flavors. We do see sweet and sour pork, dim sum, which you see in the picture there. Dim sum is sort of a if you've ever had the chance to go to Chinatown in San Francisco and experience dim sum as sort of like I guess an appetizer course for lack of a better term, you can go to restaurants and order dim sum, and they'll just have a variety of different little dishes that you can choose from, whether it's dumplings or egg rolls or other sorts of little dishes, kind of finger foods as you see here. If you've never had the opportunity to do that, I would encourage you to do so because it's a really pretty neat experience. Typical ingredients, as I've said, rice, soybeans, and soy products are very common. Stir fry is also real common, and of course, southern China is where most of our knowledge of Chinese cuisine comes from. So stir frying is something that when most Americans think of Chinese cuisine, that's sort of one of the first things that we think of is that stir frying and the sauces that go along with that. We're going to move on to Japan. And as I said at the beginning of the lecture, Japan and Korea, which are going to round out this lecture, have a lot of similarities to China, just because China is the older civilization and very heavily influenced Japan and Korea. So we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about where some of the differences are. So Japan is a multi-island nation off the coast of East Asia. There's roughly 127 million people who live there. And unlike China, Japan is completely surrounded by the ocean. So it's multi-islands, the ocean is all around. So one of the big differences that we see there is that the ocean is a great natural resource, and Japan uses that. And as you can imagine, seafood is something that we see tremendously more in Japanese cuisine than we do in Chinese cuisine. So Japanese coming to the United States, they had a very similar sort of experience to the Chinese. If you remember us talking about Chinese men coming to the United States for economic opportunity, in that case it was the gold rush. Many Japanese men also came to the United States for economic opportunity as well. Not the gold rush, but around the same time, we found in the late 19th century, Japanese started showing up in the United States. Like the Japanese, many of them eventually returned to Japan, but those that ended up staying stayed in Hawaii. There was a big immigration, Japanese immigration to Hawaii, and they are also on the west coast of the United States. So lots of Japanese settled in California and on up the west coast. Like the Chinese, many Japanese eventually worked in the railroads, and many opened their own businesses. And one of the things where they differed a little bit is that many actually went into agriculture and farming, and the Chinese didn't do that quite as much. They did the labor that was required on the railroads and opening their own businesses, but there was not as much agriculture among Chinese immigrants as there were in the Japanese immigrants. Like the Chinese, they were subject to heavy discrimination. And one of the, you see on the slide here some propaganda from people that were interested in keeping Asians out of their communities. And we saw Japanese exclusion laws that were focused against Japanese people. And during the time of World War II, there was a very increased prejudice against Japanese, just because of their belligerence in the war. So during that time, during these early years, it was very difficult for Japanese to assimilate into American society. And like the Chinese, they tended to cluster amongst themselves. And some large urban areas have Japan towns where there was protection from this discrimination. Japanese worldview, religion, many times early Japanese immigrants were a little more likely to come into the Christian church, or they may have been part of the Buddhist church as well. Today, in the United States, Japanese immigrants and descendants of immigrants are probably more likely to belong to a Protestant faith than to Buddhism. So there's no hard and fast data on that, but there's speculation that is the case. The indigenous religion of Japan is Shintoism, and much like the Confucianism and the Taoism that we talked about with the Chinese, this is a little bit more of a philosophy. It's very ingrained part of Japanese culture, and the central idea is that people are inherently good, and evil is caused by pollution that is let in. So pollution may be physical or spiritual. So there's a constant trying to keep oneself pure to to be in line with what is good in Japanese culture. Family, because of the Chinese influence, the traditional family structure has its roots in Confucianism, so very similar to Chinese, very paternal dominated family structure. Although Japanese that have moved to the United States are much more likely to live in very nuclear arrangements, and of course, the those strong paternal male-dominated family structures on moving to the United States are sometimes challenged, as we've seen in other other groups that moved to the United States. Early on in Japanese immigration to the United States, we found that most women, rather than staying home and trying to maintain that cultural family identity, many Japanese women went to work alongside their husbands to help support the family financially, which is many times just a necessity in this country. Traditional Japanese health beliefs are based and rooted in Shintoism, the avoidance of pollution and maintaining purity. So impure substances are identified, and people who wish to be healthy would avoid those substances. Botanical and herbal remedies are real common. Buddhism introduced the concept of harmony in health practice, and we talked about that with the Chinese. At this time, this is the late 16th century, at that time a lot of Chinese healing practices were added into traditional Japanese healthcare. So things like acupuncture and herbs and those sorts of things were common. The yin yang concept and that that whole balance concept was not something that really took off in Japan. That's something that we see a little bit more in Chinese medicine than Japanese. Western biomedicine was introduced to Japan in the 16th century, also the 16th century, by the Portuguese. Um, and it was actually pretty well accepted at the level that biomedicine was at anyway in the 16th century. Um, we're finding that nowadays many of the old ways, the old herbal traditional ways, are sort of, there's interest resurging in that. And in Japanese traditional medicine, the herbal medicine is referred to as Kampo. And you see the picture there, all sorts of different roots and botanical remedies. As we've seen in Western medicine, there's been sort of a resurgence of interest in how traditional healing and traditional remedies worked. And so we see a lot more illnesses and conditions being treated homeopathically or with herbs and treatments that are not high tech. Try those things first to see if they work before moving on to the traditional biomedicine approach. Traditional Japanese food habits are very similar to the Chinese, although preparation and presentation are unique. As with Chinese, presentation is very important, and meals should visually represent balance between the foods and the environment. So, again, presenting foods to not only experience the food that is on the plate, but also to take that food and use it as a way to convey an additional experience. So, what I was talking about with when I was talking about the Chinese, and I was talking about how, say, a fresh salad or a fresh spring dish might be presented with different colors. The example I have here on the slide is that a summer salad might be served in a glass dish to give the illusion of cool. Remember, in Chinese cuisine, they cook everything. And so in Japanese cuisine, you're more likely to see things that are fresh and raw. And so the dish and the presentation may help augment that a little bit more. There's not a whole lot of land that is farmable in Japan, and so even today, most of the food that's there is imported. And so the thing about Japan, if you've ever been to Japan, one of the things that you may notice is that food is very expensive for that reason. And one of the things that you may find in Japan is that very little food is wasted because of that fact. So, if food is extremely expensive, you're going to be very careful with it. And Japanese palates are pretty open to just about anything. And so a lot of the cuisine reflects that. You'll see things that the Japanese will eat that maybe in other parts of the world wouldn't necessarily be considered something that one would want to eat. So this situation of little arable farmland has tended to make the Japanese willing to eat pretty much anything. Main key ingredients, many of these ingredients that are in common with China. We see rice, we see soybeans, tea, soy products. Chinese tend to prefer long-grained rice that does not stick together, and Japan is the opposite. They prefer shorter grain rice, rice that sticks together, and it's rice that you may, if you have eaten sushi or you enjoy sushi, this is the type of rice that's used in sushi most often because it sticks together, and so you need the rice to be able to do that, to hold its shape in these sushi rolls. Common protein foods include, again, lots of different forms of soy. So tofu, fermented soybean paste, which is also called miso. If you remember, fermentation is a way of food preservation, traditional way to make food last a little bit longer and be safe. Fish and seafood, very, very common, again, because Japan is a set of islands and there is plentiful seafood all around. Many times fish and seafood are eaten raw, which is referred to as sashimi. Beef, pork, and chicken are also popular, but pricey because remember, there's not a lot of land to grow them on, so they need to be imported. So we don't see quite as much meat in the Japanese diet as we do fish. They tend to use not only rice as a core food, but wheat and buckwheat are used for noodles, so that's not uncommon. As with many of the other Asian cuisines, we really don't see the use of dairy products. And we do see very heavy use of fresh fruits and vegetables, including seaweed. There's a lot of different types of seaweed that are used in Japan, and of course with the sea surrounding it, that is a not uncommon commodity, so they use it to good effect. In this slide we see the traditional Japanese tea ceremony, and this is also sometimes called the Way of Tea. And the picture that you see there is the type of tea that is traditionally drunk in the tea ceremony. It's called matcha, and it's a powdered green tea. It's actually something that has become fairly popular here in the United States as well recently. So it's not the typical tea that is the tea leaves that are steamed or steeped in the hot water. So very different. And the green tea itself is put into the cup, hot water is added, and then it's frothed up. You can see a special whisk made of bamboo that is put inside the cup, and it's rapidly frothed so that it has that sort of fluffy appearance that you see in the cup there. So this is the type of tea that's in that ceremony. The tea ceremony itself appears to have been introduced to Japan from China by a Buddhist monk in the 9th century, so it's very old. And it's a very ritualized ceremony. If you ever have an opportunity to watch a traditional Japanese tea ceremony, you can see how specific and precise the movements are in the preparation of the tea. And itself, the ceremony was originally influenced by Zen Buddhism, so it's a very meditative process putting together the tea. Overall, it is meant to represent harmony, and the level of ritual and the level of precision that is employed during the ceremony is meant to reflect that harmony that's so important in not only Chinese culture that we've talked about, but also Japanese and East Asian culture in general. The meal that accompanies the tea ceremony is meant to be very harmonious as well by balancing different flavors: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, savory. All of those flavor sensations are balanced evenly among any food that is served during the ceremony. We'll move on to Korea. Again, I'm not spending as much time with Japan and Korea just because of the heavy Chinese influence in on both of these countries. So there's a lot of similarities, but Korea itself today is Korea is a country that is a peninsula, as you can see there, coming off of China, and it's really between China and Japan, and shares a very small common border with Russia, as you see in the map there. Um, Today it's divided into two nations, North Korea and South Korea. Uh, South Korea is a democracy, has a democratic government that's supported by the United States. The North Koreans, however, the North Korean um, government is communist and is very close with China, um, and it is politically very hostile to both South Korea and the United States. So you hear about that flare up in the news every once in a while. There's not a lot of good cultural information on North Korea. So when I'm talking about Korea here, I'm talking about what we know about South Korea and historically what we know about North Korea. The interesting thing about Korea is despite where it's located between China and Japan, the population is fairly homogeneous, meaning that the folks that live there are primarily Korean, and in terms of language and culture and food, they're pretty much the same. There's not a lot of differences, as we see in China, for example, with several different types of Chinese people speaking different dialects and having different, very different culture and food practices. Korean immigration to the United States is not as much of a story as early Japanese and Chinese immigration. There was really a very small amount of Koreans that came to the United States prior to the 20th century. And most of those people were escaping religious persecution. They were Christians, many Protestant people of the Protestant, one of the Protestant faiths, that were escaping persecution. In the early 20th century, Korea was under Japanese rule, and during that time, the Japanese forbid any Koreans from leaving the country. So there was virtually no immigration that happened during that time because the Koreans were not able to get out. In the 1920s, the Asian exclusion laws, specifically the Japanese exclusion laws, were applied to Koreans as well. So Koreans that had come to the United States prior to the 20th century were subject to these exclusion laws. And the U.S. Census currently estimates that there are about 1.3 million Koreans living in the United States at present. And half of those Koreans in this country arrived after 1980. So these are fairly recent immigrants. The majority, like other East Asians, live in California, but there are also significant populations in New York, Hawaii, Illinois, Texas, and Washington. In Korean worldview, as is similar to other East Asian cultures, many South Koreans adhere to Buddhism and Confucianism, although generally there aren't any religious majorities at this time. It's interesting to note that Christianity is very rapidly spreading, and in 2010, about 3 in 10 South Koreans identified as Christian. North Korea, because it is a communist government, they don't have an official religion. The official belief is in atheism. Family, again, is very patriarchal. Parenting is very authoritative, and traditionally males have much more opportunity in terms of education than females who were generally raised to keep house and raise children. We see differences once Koreans have come to the United States, those who have been here in subsequent generations. We see females attaining higher levels of education than they did traditionally. Elders are very esteemed, well taken care of, and respected, and we see that in many East Asian cultures. So in Korea, it is very much the same situation. For traditional Korean health practices, again, we see a lot of similarities to what the Chinese do. Balance between yin and yang is crucial to health, although the Koreans refer to rather than yin. And vital life energy is ki, so ki rather than the qi that we see in in Chinese. The concept of balance and keeping negative forces out of the body is also important here. So things like coldness, dampness, heat, wind. We see a lot of wind in a lot of our Eastern health traditions as being a damaging force. Those things are seen to interfere with qi, the life process, weakening the yang force, which causes illness. So balance, once again, is what we're after. And so, much like we saw in Chinese medicine, a balance among the elements, fire, water, earth, wood, and metal, is crucial for good health. So if something is out of balance, a traditional healer is someone that's going to put that back into balance for you. There are illnesses in traditional Korean medicine that have to do with an excess of emotions, and one of those is called hwabyang, which is a disorder resulting from it's generally having too much anger or resentment or negative feelings and really sort of failing to process those in a healthy way. So this is an example of a folk illness. In Western biomedicine, it would be looked at probably as depression and treated that way. But in the traditional sense, somebody that was suffering from this disorder would seek out a Korean shaman or a traditional practitioner, and those people are called mudang or mansin, and many times they have lots of very sacred rituals that are performed to help correct the person's imbalance or what the problem is. So again, what we see in other traditional East Asian models, this person, this healer, is going to diagnose what's going on with the person and go from there. And many times the treatment for folk illnesses involve family, so family intervention, and sometimes even community interventions with rituals. And so the picture that you see here is a Korean mudang performing an exorcism. So this is someone who is thought to be afflicted with a negative spirit, or there is some ancestor worship as well. So just putting things to rights with this rite that they're performing. We'll turn our attention to Korean food habits. And Korean cuisine is very heavily influenced by both Japanese and Chinese cuisine, although there are a lot of unique things that make it stand out on its own. And for me, one of the things that I always think of with Korean cuisine is how much the Koreans love beef. Beef is a much bigger deal in Korea than it is in Japan or China. And the Koreans have special ways of treating beef and lots of different dishes that they make with it. The top picture you see there is kalbi, which is a very famous dish of Korean barbecue short ribs. And so they're really famous for marinating and flavoring up beef and then putting it onto a grill and cooking it. Bulgogi is another traditional Korean dish that uses beef, marinated beef, which is then grilled. So it's really delicious. I've had these before, and the short ribs are really, really awesome. Um, I think where uh, Korean cuisine really differentiates itself from either Chinese or Japanese cookery is in the flavorings and the seasonings that are used in the food. So um, we see a lot of commonality. So things like ginger and garlic and scallions prominently figure, but with Korean cookery, we see a lot more liberal use of chilies and lots of hot and spicy preparations. In the bottom picture there, you see kimchi, and kimchi is a spicy, although it doesn't have to be spicy, but many times it is spicy, vegetable pickle. It's a fermented vegetable pickle, and so it takes several weeks to make. Kimchi can be made with different types of vegetables. It might be like a daikon radish, or a cabbage is really common. And so they're pickled and fermented over time and have a very distinctive flavor. Koreans will eat kimchi with almost every meal, so it's a very, very common addition, and also a very healthy addition to the meal. Rice is really important. It's a major core food in Korean cuisine, and like the Japanese, they tend to prefer the short grained rice. Sticky rice, short grained sticky rice is also really popular. Fish and shellfish are real common, and if you remember looking at the map, the Korean peninsula is surrounded on three sides by water. So there's a lot of fishing ground there, and also river fish that are more inland in Korea are also really popular. Um, the Koreans have their own brand of fish sauce. We see fish sauces show up all throughout Asia, not only in East Asia, but we see it in Southeast Asia as well. Um, the uh, the Korean variety is actually made of a small crustacean, and it's you see the name there, sewujat, which I'm probably not doing justice to the pronunciation there, but it's a fermented fish sauce that is a really common condiment and is used on a lot of different foods and is one of the flavors that helps define Korean cuisine as different. I'm going to wrap this lecture up just by talking briefly about chopsticks because they're so common in East Asia. And the thought, of course, is that they were likely invented as an extension of the fingers, so rather than just eating simply with the hands, chopsticks provided a little more sanitary way to do that. Chopsticks are thought to have been in use for over 6,000 years, so this is a really old way of eating, and the chopsticks are typically found in countries that have strong Chinese influence. So, of course, the thinking is that since we know China is the older civilization, they probably developed there and then spread out through East Asia. We don't really see these used too much in Southeast Asia. It's just pretty much a regional thing that we see in China and Korea and Japan. But the styles in the different countries vary. So Chinese chopsticks, as you see there, may be made from several different materials: bamboo, plastic, wood, etc. The Chinese chopsticks are the longest of those that you find in East Asia. They may be rounded or squared off, and the tips may be blunt or pointed. So you can see in the picture there, I've got sort of a squared top with a blunt end on that chopstick. Japanese chopsticks are much shorter than the Chinese variety. And they tend to have rounded sides and more pointed tips, and so they're a little bit more sleek than what you would find Chinese style. And you'll see that in the drawing that I have next to it, Japanese. Korean chopsticks are usually made of metal. Um, they are short like the Japanese chopsticks, but down toward the end they tend to be flatter. So maybe a little easier to grab food with a flatter chopstick. But I've never eaten with Korean chopsticks, so but it sounds like it might be a little easier. And that is the end of our lecture today.